Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest is a poet. His name is Michael S. Harper. It's a great pleasure. Who is the real Michael S. Harper?
Oh, I guess it's a 5-year-old boy who grew up in his grandparents' house in Brooklyn, New York, that is. And when I think about my childhood, I think about the house I was born in, the same place that my mother was born in, Brooklyn, New York.
And what was life like growing up in Brooklyn?
World War II, I was born in 1938, so when I got to a certain kind of consciousness, it was probably somewhere between my brother's birthday and my sister's birthday. My brother was born in 41 and my sister was born in 43. And I was the oldest, and I was responsible for both of them because my grandmother, who was living with us, had a series of strokes, and she finally died in 1947.
Did you enjoy reading as a young person?
Well, I was taught to read by my mother before I went to school. And the first book I remember, 1001 Nights, the story of Scheherazade. In fact, I used to call my sister, who's 5 years younger than me, I used to call her Scheherazade. So that's where it comes from.
What about early examples of writing?
Early examples of writing. Well, I went to kindergarten. You can imagine what kindergarten was like when I could already read. This gave me a terrific advantage in one way or another. And I guess when you're taught by either one of your parents, they become your first teacher. Other than going to class, going back and forth, I don't remember kindergarten being traumatic in any way. And I think it's because of preparation. I wasn't surprised that they were expecting me to do things. And of course, when World War II was in operation, the whole ambiance was full of people in uniforms and all that sort of thing. And my parents didn't know, but I started riding the subway when I was 5 years old without their knowledge. So I was going, from borough to borough and from Brooklyn to Manhattan and all kinds of places like that when I was a little kid.
When you were doing this on the subway, were you afraid? Or were you just totally confident?
No, I never had any fear. And one of the things is that during that period of time, if you stopped anybody, let's say if you were lost, if you stopped anybody who was an adult, it might be a policeman, it might not, any adult felt a responsibility to make sure that the kid who was lost got sent somewhere, taken somewhere. They would either take you themselves or they would introduce you to somebody who could rescue you in one way or another. That might be a policeman, but no, it might not. So as I remember, as 5, 6, 7 years old, I had no fear, and I was already riding not only the subway, but I would take the ferry from Battery Park to Staten Island.
And what were you doing?
I was on an adventure. I left my brother at home because my brother would have got me caught. He was 3 years younger and much more venturesome than me, but I was venturesome enough, riding around on subways and ferries and so on without anybody's knowledge. That was adventure for me, plenty.
That's fascinating. How did you discover poetry?
Well, I guess I was read to a lot when I was a child. Either my grandmother read to me or my parents. My father didn't read too much because he was working 2 jobs. He was working in the post office and he was also going to law school. Mostly my mother and my grandmother who read to me, and I've never recovered from it, actually. I mean, I don't think anything is more heartwarming, anything more transcendent than somebody who you care about reading to you. So I was read to as a child. And of course, since I was the first grandson in the family, everybody read to me. My aunts read to me, my relatives. All of these people were adults.
When did you begin to identify yourself as a poet?
Oh, I don't think certainly that was after high school, I would think. I mean, it wasn't so much that I wasn't interested in poetry or I wasn't interested in reading and writing. But the business of having a vocation like writing poetry, that didn't come until I had been moved with a family to Los Angeles, which I did when I was 13, 1951. And pretty much junior high school and college were kind of like a blur. What I mean by blur is that I guess that I always had in the back of my mind returning to my original place of origin. And as I used to say to people, when they used to ask me provocative questions, I would say, well, I lost my first neighborhood. First neighborhood, of course, was Brooklyn. And I guess that was a kind of euphemism, maybe. I didn't spell out what losing one's neighborhood was about. I just knew I'd lost it.
Could you pick any one poet who has been the greatest influence on your work?
Greatest influence on my work? As I think now, probably the Romantic poets, beginning with Keats. That was probably my greatest influence. And of course, I didn't read poetry systematically like they do now. I mean, you were free to read anywhere you wanted to, in any period. And I knew enough about poetry and the English. I mean, I knew that the English were, for example, not Americans. I made that distinction. But my examples, for example, were not Whitman. I mean, I knew people that loved Whitman, and they might have loved Frost. But I think my first real immersion were with the Romantics. I would say Keats, probably.
If you could put it into words, what is it that you like most about poetry?
Well, I think line length, lineation, the way in which you break a line on a page, or perhaps in your head, or, I mean, I seem to be sensitive to that. I don't know why my mother wants to stay here for. This old world ain't been no friend to her. Now, that's a perfect couplet. I can remember being sung to as a little boy by my grandmother, whose favorite song was Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. I don't know why this was so, but that's just something she sung to me, and she often hummed it, so I therefore knew and probably associated the kinds of tunes that I heard, the melodies that I heard. And I came from a musical family. People were always singing. My mother was certainly always singing, and my grandmother as well.
Well, if at any point you feel like breaking into poem, we encourage that.
Okay, all right. Let me see what I'd like to read to you. I've edited a lot of books in my career, and I sometimes read poems either to myself or to a class or whatever. I'm going to choose this one. It's called Nightmare Begins Responsibility. It is a kind of meditation. When I get to the end of it, I'll read it twice so you can follow. So Nightmare Begins Responsibility. And I'll say that W.B. Yeats, who's one of my favorite poets, used to say in a poem called Responsibilities, "In dream begin responsibilities." And since I was a kid, oftentimes influenced by my elders, this probably stuck with me. Anyway, Nightmare Begins Responsibility. I place these numb wrists to the pain, watching white uniforms whisk over him in the tube-kept prison. Fear what they will do and experiment. Watch my gloved, stick-shifting, gasoline hands breathe. Boxcar inflammation, please. Infirmary tubes, distrusting white pink, mending paper-thin, silken end hairs. Distrusting tubes shrunk in his trunk skin cap shaven head. In thighs, distrusting white hands picking baboon light. On this son who will not make his second night of this ward-strewn, intensive air pocket, where his father's asthmatic hymns of night train trained and gone. His mother can only know that he has flown up into essential calm, unseen corridor, going boxguard home, mama, sweet son, child, gone downtown into research, testing warehouse battery acid, mama, son done gone. Me telling her another train tonight, no music, no breaststroke, heartbeat, in my infinite distrust of them. And of my distrusting self, white doctor who breathed for him all night. Say it for Tucson gone, say nightmare, say it loud, pain-breaking heart madness. Nightmare begins responsibility. And of my distrusting self, white doctor who breathed for him all night. Say it for two sons gone, say nightmare, say it loud, pain-breaking heart madness. Nightmare begins responsibility.
Wow. Our special guest is Michael S. Harper. He just did a poem for us. I wanted to talk a little bit about John Coltrane. Tell us about meeting him and his influence on your life.
Well, I've heard Coltrane play in live, that is to say, in nightclubs or in concerts or whatever. I would say hundreds of times. The poem that I would say was probably an anthem to me is a poem called Here Where Coltrane Is. This is how the poem goes. Soul and race are private dominions, memories and modal songs, a tenor blossoming, which would paint suffering a clear color, but is not in this Victorian house, without oil, in 0-degree weather, and a 40-mile-an-hour wind. It is all a well-knit family, a love supreme. Oak leaves pile up on walkway and steps, Catholic as apples, in a special mist of clear white children who love my children. I play Alabama on a warped record player, skipping the scratches on your faces, over the fibrous conical hairs of plastic, under the wooden floors. Dreaming on a train from New York to Philly, you hand out 6 notes which become an anthem to our memories of you. Oak, birch, maple, apple, cocoa, rubber. For this reason, Martin is dead. For this reason, Malcolm is dead. For this reason, Coltrane is dead. In the eyes of my first son are the browns of these men and their music.
Thank you very much for doing that performance. For all the listeners out there, what do you think jazz music has in common with poetry?
There's a kind of syncretism. That's an important word to say. There's a syncretism, and there's something that's shared with the human voice. If one, for example, a saxophone is the perfect instrument for a saxophone, of course, is the human voice. It has the same timbre, the same possibilities, the same range. Even though I'm not a musician, I did play piano when I was young, took piano lessons. I knew that my love for the saxophone, the sound of it, was something that made an impact on me, when I was in my childhood. And of course, I listened to an awful lot of music, big band music. My parents loved big band music. They had a record collection. I heard a lot of live music when I was older, high school. But the most important thing is there's a symmetry between how one would write a poem, recite it, and how one would play a song or an instrument. Now, later on, I became involved and interested in sonics, S-O-N-I-C-S, which is to say the sound that an instrument makes. And all kinds of instruments make sounds, but the one that was most conducive to me, given my range, was a saxophone. Now, you would think that I would play one, but I was more concerned about how it sounded than anything else, and I don't know why I didn't become a musician. I guess because I probably couldn't have been as good as I needed to be, given all of the great musicians and all the great music that I heard from the time I was a boy until I was in my early 20s. So, for example, Coltrane was a theme that I've written a lot about. This particular poem, which I read here where Coltrane is, was written in Portland, Oregon, where I was beginning to teach in the late 60s. So geography and locale meant a lot to me. I mean, if I was in San Francisco, that was one thing. If I was in Portland, it was another. If I was in Champaign-Urbana, that was another. The location of where it was at the time, oftentimes, was simulated into whatever I was likely to write or think about.
What is the thing that gets your creative juices going the most?
Well, it could be a song. That is to say, it could be something that I've heard either on the radio or in my own. I could be transported, taken to a place that I wouldn't ordinarily go. If I heard a song, for example, Alabama, which is a dirge, and it was about the 4 black kids that were blown up in an Alabama church, and I can remember hearing that live, Alabama, when I didn't even know what the name of it was. Later on, it became connected with these girls who were blown up in a church. I think it was September 1963. But whatever musicians did in terms of express themselves was something that made an impact on me, particularly since I listened to so much live music. If Coltrane came to town, let's say in San Francisco, and he played for 2 weeks, there would not be a single part of his engagement that I would miss. I'd hear every single set that he played. night after night, and even matinees. Matinees would come, let's say, on Sunday afternoon. I'd hear every session that he played. And if he appeared on television, I'd probably see that presentation. I remember when Ralph Gleason, who was a local critic in San Francisco where I was living at the time, he invited Coltrane to one of his programs, and I listened to it. And then later on, we had a correspondence because I had written poems about musicians, and he always cautioned me. He would say, well, you know, you should worry about the copyright of such and such, of who sang what, or whatever. Now, critics are always worried about attribution, but if you're an artist, you're not very much concerned about attribution. You just write what comes to you. So even though I realized later on that I was preempting, that is to say, locating myself right in, let's say, a melody that had been sung by someone else, attribution was not a problem, at least in my head. I wasn't stealing from them or borrowing from them. I was just registering what had come my way.
Interesting. What is your biggest hope?
My biggest hope? You know, I've been teaching for 40 years at the Brown University, and even before then, before I even got to Brown, so I've been teaching a long time. And I guess my greatest hope is to continue to teach and to continue to create. There is a kind of symbiosis between those two. I find now that when I teach, and I only teach in the fall, but when I teach my classes, I don't seem to write as much. The energy which one needs to compose is all-consuming, and when I'm teaching, that involves other batteries. And even though when I was young and used to teach more preparations, including composition, including remedial English sometimes, I don't have that much stamina or juice anymore. And probably what that's about is a greater consciousness of how poems should be written. And sometimes I will know what it is I want to say even before I begin. I'll have a sense of what I want to accomplish in a poem. Sometimes it will fall into a certain pattern. Let's say I'm writing a series of poems in couplets, and then I'll do that for sometimes years, trying to find out what is it that I'm trying to get to. Am I trying to mimic, let's say, a heroic couplet? Well, a heroic couplet, I learned about heroic couplets when I was studying literature in high school and college. So I don't want to be an Alexander Pope. He's been dead for centuries. But at the same time, I realize what it is that other artists, other poets have contributed to what we'll call aesthetic. So that's what I would say in terms of my hope. I hope I have a long enough life so that I get down pretty much what I want to say before I close the book on me. And how long that will be, one can't know.
What is your favorite sound?
Sound? I would say a saxophone. I mean, you know, whether it's played by Lester Young or whether it's played by Coltrane or whether it's played by Sonny Rollins or whether it's played by Hank Mobley, all of these people not only played their instruments, but they also composed. They also wrote music. And this music has gotten incorporated into my lexicon. For example, Mobley wrote a tune called High Mode. If I were to think about how that tune was composed, memory is first of all with me, always. And even though I'm not a musician, the tune itself, how it's composed and when, it's important.
Are there any dreams you have yet to realize that haven't come to fruition yet?
There was a time in my development when a whole book would come to me. I would know what the theme was, and sometimes I would hope that I had enough time. I ran a literary program, graduate program, for about 9.5 years, and it affected my production. And I oftentimes postponed things that I wanted to do until later. Also, I did a lot of collaboration with musicians in concert, in tours, over the years. I might want to do that again. I might want to go back. Maybe retirement for me would be having a group of musicians and recording things that I wanted to do and haven't done before. Maybe I'd want to do that.
What is the best thing about being Michael S. Harper?
The best thing? I've had a lot of luck in my life. For example, when I first was offered the job at Brown University, I had to leave my favorite town, San Francisco, in order to take the job. And I thought I'd be here for a year or two, and then I'd move on. Well, of course, that isn't what happened. I've been here since 1970. Maybe it's my destiny. Maybe it was where I was supposed to be. maybe I'm back on the East Coast where I began. I started out on the East Coast, and I lived in San Francisco a long time. Would I go back there? I doubt it. Now, would I visit? Of course. But would I permanently go back? I don't think so. As Epictetus used to say, geography is fate. Where it is that you grow up and where it is you live has a certain kind of fate. I guess I believe that.
That's interesting. Well, my last question for anyone who's listening to this interview, wherever they are, whenever they hear it, what are your parting words for them?
My parting words are in a refrain, which I wrote years ago about Bessie Smith, Last Affair, so I'll read it. It's called Last Affair, Bessie's Blues Song, and it's a ballad. The first word of the poem is the severing from the arm, that is to say, Bessie Smith's arm, from the torso of her body. The word is disarticulated, which sounds like a medical term, and it is a medical term. Last Affair, Bessie's Blues Song. Disarticulated arm torn out, large veins cross her shoulder intact, her tourniquet, her blood, in all white big bands. Can't you see what love and heartache's done to me? I'm not the same as I used to be. This is my last affair. Mail truck or parked car in the fast lane, afloat at 43 on a Mississippi road, 200-pound muscle on her ham bone, another nigger dead for noon. Can't you see what love and heartache's done to me? I'm not the same as I used to be. This is my last affair. $50 record cut the vein in her neck. Fool about her money told her black train wreck. White dress missed her funeral in the same stacked deck. Can't you see what love and heartache's done to me? I'm not the same as I used to be. This is my last affair. Loved a little blackbird heard she could sing. Martha in her vineyard, Tessel in her spring. Bessie had a bad mouth. Bessie had a bad mouth. Made my chimes ring. Can't you see what love and heartache's done to me? I'm not the same as I used to be. This is my last affair. So, just to follow up on Ralph Gleason, Gleason wrote to me and said, this particular refrain that you're singing is very close to the way in which Billie Holiday recorded this particular song. And I said, well, you know, the words are changed, but the significance is pretty much the same. And of course, Billie Holiday did not copyright her singing the song. Bessie Smith did. And what's the relationship between the two? Well, they're both singers. They're both artists. Can't you see what love and heartache's done to me? I'm not the same as I used to be. This is my last affair. I think that's a pretty good refrain.
I think so. Well, thank you very, very much for this interview.
Well, thanks for asking, and hope to talk to you again.